Hi there. Here today we're going to do how to get started with Red Hat Service Interconnect. And I'm going to introduce Service Interconnect, tell you how I sort of took a monolith application, broke it up, and managed to have a distributed architecture in the cloud and back to on-premise in the database. So what is Service Interconnect? Well, it's an application-focused integration. It sets up a virtual application network where I can connect pretty much anything from anywhere. Has mutual TLS encryption, uses layer 7 addressing, but it will sort of enwrap the TCP. It will enable sort of TCP traffic through its AMQP network underneath that it establishes. So it can create a zero trust application service cloud. It can connect applications and services. You can connect namespaces of different Kubernetes clusters, and you can get services outside the cluster seen as a service within that Kubernetes namespace. It secures data with mutual TLS, very firewall friendly, and can do NAT traversal. And I'll show you today I've got a database behind a NAT where I'm enabling that to become a participant in a Kubernetes namespace. It also has smart routing, so it doesn't just establish one-to-one network connectivity. It does create a whole network. You have redundant network paths. You can do load balancing. You can do cost-based application routing. If you wanted to connect namespaces on 2 different Kubernetes clusters, very easily set up that virtual application network with 2 Skupper routers on either end, connect them together, expose services within the namespace to that Skupper network, and then they will be visible within that namespace for services to use. Here we got a VM here, looking at a VM database. So that gateway has a service forward function where it allows me to expose that database into the Kubernetes namespace as a SQL service. And the application shouldn't really need any code changes. It'll simply point to that service name as its typical host, and hey presto, it should all work. And we're going to see that in the demo today. But essentially, just don't think of it as those 2 simple use cases. There's a number of use cases, and we are growing those use cases as we find out more, and we talk to more people and see what they need. But essentially, if you need to connect something on-prem into cloud, from cloud to cloud, from Kubernetes cluster to Kubernetes cluster, from VM to a Kubernetes cluster. So what have we got? We've got a monolith application. It's been an app server talking to a database. I managed to refactor that into a front end and back end, and the back end talks to the database. The database is still on-prem. And what we're going to see, what I'm going to set up for you is I've got a database running in a VM. I've got a back end, and that will be running in one OpenShift cluster, and I'll have the front end running in a separate public cloud cluster. And you should be able to do this, on your own, and have a look down the bottom for the steps that I'm going to do this demo. Should be able to follow along. So here I've got my EC2 instance. This is where I've got my database running. It's in the VPC I've established going through a NAT gateway. So, that's how it has outbound access to the internet, but there's nothing inbound. First of all, I'm going to create a new project where my application will live in modernization. The next thing I'm going to do is do a Skupper init. So I'm initializing Skupper. I'm also enabling the console so I can have a topology view when I go in there. Give it a nominal name and password. So what that's going to do is going to create a couple of Skupper routers within that namespace. So I've just got one router. I don't have a network as such in the moment, but Skupper is now enabled in that namespace. I'm then going to apply my project, and I'm going to deploy, in this case I'm deploying my front end and back end, but I'll also deploy my front end later on into the public cloud. But we'll do the stage 1 first. And if I show you what's running in the pods, at the moment I've got my database here. So now what I'm going to do, I've got my Skupper initialized, I've got some pods running here under app-modernization, I've got my backend and front end. The backend won't be active yet because it's not talking to the database, won't be ready. My front end, and I've got my Skupper router. And if I go into my Skupper console, we call this site on premises, no addresses exposed. So now what I'm going to do is create a gateway on my VM behind the NAT gateway. I'm basically exposing the local host on 5432 where Postgres is running. I'm running it with Podman, and I'm exposing it with the name DB. So when I go to my project here, I will now see a DB service. And if I now look at my pods again, I'll see the backend has been restarted. And let me go into the logs. Okay, that will have to run its health check again and it'll restart. So we've got an internal service error. Once that backend restarts and connects to the database, we will see, okay, it's about to almost ready. So this is the back end. It looks good. Hey presto. And if I look at the queue, it's a simple queue here. I've got a couple of names in there now. That is talking to the database on my VM. Let's just simply add another name, Bob. So that's added another name, Bob. And just to prove that it's in my database at the back end, let's go and run a SQL query. So that's on my DemoDB, and you can see the new entry there started. Okay, so what's that mean? So under I can look at Skupper gateway status, and you can see I have exposed my localhost 5432 as a gateway onto the Skupper network. If I go to the Skupper network now, I will start to see my on-premise. This link is now come into the on-premise, and I am able to call that DB as exposed. Okay, so what about Kubernetes namespaces? The Kubernetes namespaces. So and the next step I'm going to do is deploy the front end. All right, so now the front end's created. I've got my front end here with my route. If I click onto that now, that should give an error because it doesn't, there is no back end exposed. So what I need to do now is connect those Skupper instances, Skupper routers together. So I am going to create a token, and in this token, this file here, that has the certificates, TLS keys, and connection information of where to connect to this Skupper router. I will now use that key. I'll now link them together. So I can do a Skupper status. The next thing I need to do is need to expose my backend. So in theory now, if we go to the topology of that console, we will see I've got an on-premise. I've got two on-premises. One of those is a different cluster. I guess that's sort of there's a name that you can sort of give it when you're connecting. So I've got my gateway connecting to on-premise cluster, and I've got my public cloud cluster here. So we've got the two namespaces connected. Only the namespaces are connected. So the next thing I need to do, I've still only got my database address advertised within the Skupper network. So now I'm going to expose my backend, which is actually running as a service in Kubernetes, but I'm going to expose that into the Skupper network. And this should enable my front-end service within the public cloud to see that. We've now got a back-end service. On my arrow under the default, if I look at services, I should now, that DB was advertised there as well because that was already exposed, but I've now got a back-end service. If I go to my front end, this should now resolve that back-end service name through the Skupper network, and I can still see the latest entry that I put before, Bob. So that is the introduction to Skupper. Feel free to look at the details below the page there. Email me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.